going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's your favorite reactor, Senpai Reacts, and I got something new for y'all. This is One Take Glitch Crew K-pop in public. Just something new on the channel. I might check out more of these. Let me know if you like it in the comment section. Make sure you like that video, and as always, if you're new, subscribe to the channel. All right, let's glitch. Things like Australia dance crew, something like that. K-pop in public. What's the name of the song? Love 119 RZA. Hey, this song, hey, this crew, this is a really good dance crew, but besides, like, this song that intro was crazy. Yeah, I might need to actually check it. I don't know if that's a group or not, or a person, but I need to check that song out. That was a crazy intro.
Let's go. Making my heart that girl so killer. Love so good feels like a thriller. 이건 emergency. 119119. Save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love. 너는 마치 flashlight. 자꾸만 시선을 뺏겨. 많은 사람 속에서 순간 너만 보였어.
I'd be so nervous to do this in public. All these people just watching me.
신경 쓰여 난 all day 너만대로 my day 이 감정은 someday 난 알고 싶어 Love is so sweet so sweet 멈출 수 없이 빠져버린 나야 네가 자꾸 궁금해 왠지 말도 안 돼 I'm not kidding 시간이 갈수록 깊어져가는 나잖아 Making my heart that girl so killer
Okay, sorry to pause, but Jesus, this song is so good. Like, Jesus, who is Love 119? What's this group? Why I never heard this song before? Is this an old group or something? Like, why nobody never recommended me this song or something? I need to find this video and watch this video because this sounds crazy. And this glitch crew, they're really good dancers. Like, they picked the perfect song. I think we'll say from Australia. Like, this video is like amazing, and the song is amazing. Like, I need to find this. I need to find the song.
시간이 갈수록 깊어져가는 나잖아 Making my heart that girl so killer so good feels like a thriller 이건 emergency 119119 Save my life She sets me free 이건 emergency love 이건 뭘까 You know what I'm talking about 왜 이렇게 나의 마음이 어지러운 걸까 이 모든 게 내가 널 좋아하는 건가 난 그럼 더 이상 끌고 싶지 않아 다른 건 nothing but I want it all with you Making my heart that girl's a killer Love so good feels like a thriller 시작됐지 이건 emergency One night Save my life Save my life She set me free 이건 emergency love
Fire, 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 fire. Oh, that one. That was a fire song. Fire video, fire song. Dance is amazing. Song amazing. I need to watch more of these. This is actually pretty good. I'm surprised I liked it so much. Like, I'm surprised I like this dancing in the video so much, and I'm surprised I like the song so much. So if you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. If you enjoyed this video, just leave a like on the video and just share it and like subscribe. So I know you guys like these videos and I keep throwing them out and keep the reactions going. I see you guys in the next reaction.